here's what I'm going to talk about for the next 2 sessions. I suppose I'll leave it up here. I hope it's not distracting if it stays up there so that I don't have to pay attention to it anymore. What I'm hoping to do for the next 2 sessions is to introduce a little bit the modern day conflict between science and religion. Talk a little bit about its origin, talk a little bit about where I feel the roots of this conflict lie. And then I'll talk about how different groups of people have responded to this, what I'll say, apparent contradiction between science and religion. And in particular, I'll focus on a group that in the United States, in any case, is and in the UK, is increasingly known as the new atheist. Not that atheism is a new thing, but that there's a new and sort of more vocal, more activist approach to atheism being taken and as represented by a number of very best-selling books and very prominent personalities. And so I'll spend a bit of time talking about trying to summarize a bit what the arguments of these new atheists are. And then I'll talk about, after that, the inadequacy of the responses to their arguments. Finally, and this will be mostly the next session, I'll talk about what I will propose to be elements in a new approach to dealing with the conflict between science and religion. And the elements will come from both the science side and the religion side. Coming from a background in physics, I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about some new ideas in physics, new meaning the last century, some new discoveries, some new understandings about the nature of the physical world as revealed by modern physics. I promise I won't use any equations, but I'll just try to describe these advances in layman's terms. And then I'll try to put it together with some ideas from the Baha'i writings that I believe are complementary with those, and that together suggest really a revolutionary new way of thinking about the phenomenon of religion, the phenomenon of revelation. So we are, in terms of the religious communities of mankind, we're living increasingly in a period of crisis. I'll say crisis because ever since really the dawn of the age of reason and the scientific revolution several centuries ago, mankind has been more and more thrust out of the position of the center of the universe, which he had occupied from the dawn of history. Really, throughout human history, we have been convinced that we were at the center of the universe. Both spatially, we believed that the world was flat, and even when we understood that the world was round, we believed that the sun and all the planets circled around the earth, and of course all the stars and everything else circled around the earth. But more importantly, we saw ourselves at the center of the universe in a more metaphysical sense as well, that everything was created solely for our sakes. And this understanding of the centrality of man in relation to the universe was displaced, jarringly displaced, by 2 movements in particular in modern science. The first of these was cosmology. It was as early as the 14 and 1500s that astronomers and thinkers first began to look into the night sky and to get the idea that perhaps the Earth was not quite the center of things. Actually, you could go all the way back to some of the ancient Greeks who also had these ideas, but it wasn't until just a few hundred years ago that evidence actually began to mount that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. And in fact, not only was the Earth not at the center of the universe, but the Earth was infinitesimally small compared to the vast size of the universe. The first stage in this understanding came when when some of the first astronomers, Bruno was one of the first, an Italian astronomer, came up with the hypothesis that those points of light in the sky outside were actually just like our sun, but they were so far away that they simply appeared as points of light. And this was a major revolution. This made us very uncomfortable to realize how small we were in relation to the vastness of the cosmos. And of course, later on in the 20th century, when we understood not only was the sun simply a star like millions, hundreds of millions of other stars, but that all the stars that we could see comprised a single island universe, a single galaxy, and we were simply at some corner of some otherwise unremarkable galaxy in the universe, which contained hundreds of millions of other galaxies. And there was no identifiable center to it all. Mankind became increasingly relegated spatially to some, forgotten corner of some otherwise unremarkable part of what may end up being, and the jury is still out on this, a spatially infinite universe. All we can say is that the more we look, the more galaxies we see. The farther out we look, the dimmer the light becomes and the harder it is to see. We don't see, obviously, an edge to the universe. And the jury is still out, actually, whether it continues on until infinity or whether it wraps in on itself or in some other configuration. But it's vast indeed. And so the first of these two movements displacing us from our comfortable position at the center of the universe was cosmology. The second movement was far more wrenching. And this movement was initiated by a fellow by the name of Charles Darwin. Darwin had the idea in the mid-19th century that life on Earth and the emergence of life on Earth has a rational explanation, has an explanation that can ultimately be reduced to a few basic principles, principles of natural selection, principles of genetic variation, and so forth, as Darwinian theory advanced and as the structure of the human genome became known and so forth. We understood more and more that there is a possible mechanism, a purely natural mechanism by which human life can evolve. Of course, this mechanism is something that it's not as if it requires a designer at the beginning to set this thing in motion. In other words, it's a purely natural mechanism. It doesn't seem to require any sort of higher intelligence to get it moving. All it requires is the right mix of chemicals, the right kind of stable system over a period of time, and a very long period of time for it to happen. And so we have found ourselves in the present century displaced from this position of the center. But more than ourselves being displaced from the center, God himself has also been dethroned, if you will, in the following sense. Up until fairly modern times, whatever we didn't understand about the universe was chalked up to the activity of the gods. We didn't understand the phenomenon of lightning. It was Zeus with his thunderbolts. We didn't understand the phenomenon of disease. It was death with his sickle, and so forth. All of the natural processes which we didn't understand were personified by various divine agencies. With the onward march of science, however, our understanding of the world around us gradually consolidated. And it was found that this idea of divine activity, the idea that the divinity or divinities are those beings that sort of make the world around us work in the ways that we can see but not understand, that picture of the divine gradually became obsolete as science came to be able to describe to greater and greater detail and with a greater and greater degree of completeness all of the phenomena that we could observe and everything that we could measure around us. So this idea of the divine as the being that explains the unexplained comes under the name, which you may or may not have heard before, of the God of the gaps. There are gaps in our understanding, and this God of the gaps fills in the gaps in our understanding. So one way to put this displacement of the divine in the modern age is to say that the God of the gaps has gradually been squeezed out, because there are very few gaps left. Very few gaps left in modern science. We still don't understand the nature of consciousness. We still don't understand, the why of the laws of physics. Why are they the way they are? How did the universe come into being in the first place? There are theories about that, but there's a few gaps left. These may end up, of course, being significant, but compared to our vast ignorance of the way things worked up until relatively modern times, there's very little wiggle room left for that sort of a divinity to operate. And so from the perspective of a modern day scientist, it's not so much that God's existence has been disproven as much as it has been shown to be, in a sense, superfluous. Someone, it was, I think, the mathematician Laplace, was showing Napoleon a model of the universe that had been created, one of these mechanical models where you turn the crank and the planets revolve around the Earth, and you can predict the position of the planets and the moon at different times. It's called an Ori, at least one word for it. And Laplace was showing Napoleon this thing, and Napoleon said, "Yes, but who made this this contraption, or didn't God make this contraption?" And Laplace responded, "I have no need for that hypothesis." So it sums up this idea, which is really has come to be the really dominant paradigm in science, that the idea of God is no longer a necessary hypothesis. It's sufficient for us to explain the world solely in terms of these constant mathematical laws. And whatever complexity, whatever we still don't understand, even things as vastly complex as human consciousness itself, ultimately, even though we don't understand the ins and outs of it, it gets sort of put into a black box and said, well, we'll understand that someday once our science progresses, then we'll ultimately come to an understanding of things as opaque to us today as human consciousness. So not only has the advance of modern science made the idea of divine action a very problematic thing from the point of theology, but it's also made belief in God a difficult thing from another perspective. And this goes under the word theodicy. Theodicy is a technical term in theology, which basically means the problem of evil. That's one way to summarize what theodicy is. It's the problem of belief in an omnipotent and all-powerful and a benevolent God in the face of the existence of evil. This problem, because if assuming God is good, God would want to remove the pain and suffering that people on earth exist. If this pain and suffering exists, and if God wants to remove it, but cannot, and that's why we have this pain and suffering, then God is not omnipotent. So there's a problem of the idea of a loving and caring God, of a loving and caring deity. It's seemingly incompatible with a world that is dominated by suffering and with a constant struggle for survival in which all are eaters or eaten. And the advent of modern evolutionary theory has really sharpened that problem of theodicy, because it's becoming more and more clear from the point of view of evolutionary biology that life got here through this process of constant struggle, through a cold and pitiless process of constant struggle, where really suffering and pain are the dominant keynotes. And in that sort of a universe, the problem of the existence of a benevolent God and the simultaneous existence of so much pain and suffering is to many an issue. Now, from a Baha'i perspective, of course, we have answers to this. We have perspectives on this. Mr. Naqshbandi mentioned earlier this morning in relation to why the chaos, why so much suffering in the name of religion. And Mr. Naqshbandi gave us the example of the ocean or the river, I can't remember what, vast body of water that rushes through and plows down old structures. It is destructive as well as life-giving. And that's one approach to that. But I'll get into more elements of a Baha'i response later on. What I'm trying to do is setting up the problem. Setting up that in the mind of people today who see the success of science and who are really convinced of the validity of the scientific enterprise, the old notions of God and old notions of religion are coming under a certain amount of pressure. Now, what are some of the responses that have been made to this state of tension, to this state of pressure between religion as traditionally understood and science as it exists? There's a few different responses, and these can be classified in a few different categories. One response is to say, well, science and religion actually don't contradict each other. They don't conflict with each other because they're like strangers. They can coexist as long as they keep a safe distance from each other. Religion has its own sphere. It tells us how to live, and science has its own sphere. It tells us how things work. And as long as we keep these two spheres separate, then everyone will get along fine. That's one approach to resolving the conflict between science and religion. This approach is somewhat problematic, however, because there is overlap between it. You can't deny that there is a degree of overlap, that religion also tells us something about how the world is. It doesn't just tell us about how we should live, it also tells us something about the structure of reality. And on the other side, science also can have something to say about how we should live our lives. It's possible that there's an area of overlap between them. And it's inevitable, I think, that there will be an area of overlap between them. Not only because of the nature of the two, but because if religion ultimately is a reflection of reality itself, then why should it occupy a different sphere than science? Why should we see religion and science as being two different domains? Aren't they both ultimately describing the same reality but from a different perspective? I'll get into that point more tomorrow. So this is one response to this tension between science and religion, and this is to say, well, let's just keep them independent. But that's a problematic response. Another response popularly goes under the name of intelligent design. I don't know how many people have heard of intelligent design or intelligent design theory. People, if you've read a few books or articles recently on the subject of science and religion, you might have heard that there's a group of people who have education in science, but who are committed, at the same time, they're committed Christians. And they accept the reality of evolution up to a point, but they believe that it will come to a point where we won't be able to explain how the complexity of life arose. We can explain how life evolves maybe over the course of millions, even billions of years. They have no problem accepting that the Earth, could be billions of years old and not a few thousand years old like some creationists believe. But they'll say, in the end, we're going to have to appeal to some other agency to explain the complexity of life. For instance, they point to even some of the smallest bacteria, some of the smallest microorganisms, the little ones with the little tail that whips around and that swims through the algae and eats algae, that sort of a thing. the paramecium and so forth, you look at the structure of the tail and how the tail moves. It's structured just like an outboard motor, with all sorts of little shafts and rotors and these sorts of things. It looks like a small machine, really. And they look at this and they say, look, this could not have come into being through some natural process. It couldn't have come into being through a sequence of gradual steps. There had to have been a designer. There had to have been some sort of blueprint out of which, this outboard motor of the bacteria's tail has been stamped. Ultimately, though, this idea of things, which may at first view sound enticing or sound like, well, maybe that's what the Baha'i writings would say as well, because we also believe that there's the interaction of the divine with creation. So maybe this is that point. Maybe this is where God interacts. Maybe this is where the finger of God touches creation. But this idea of irreducible complexity is also coming under a great deal of pressure by the onward march of our understanding of evolution. And it has been shown, there are plausible mechanisms by which these seemingly irreducibly complex things can come into existence. The human eye, such an amazingly complex thing, made of all of these different parts. You take away one part and you can't see. You're absolutely blind. How can you imagine that such a thing can come into existence through a series of gradual steps? But evolutionary biology has shown that the eye is actually developed on parallel lines in a number of different organisms. The octopus has its own eye, which was actually developed completely separately from the human eye. In other words, they've proposed that there are natural mechanisms by which these very complex things can come into being. Ultimately, though, this intelligent design theory and other theories similar to it all suffer from a similar problem. The problem is they are all different versions of the God of the gaps. They all, in different ways, ultimately, if you push them against the wall, they'll ultimately say that there's some unexplained part of the universe, and that unexplained part of the universe ultimately can only have God as the explanation. Only the activity of a divine being can explain how this little piece of it came into existence. The rest of it, we can go with the laws of nature, but this little piece of it, we have to appeal to a higher being. And that kind of a position, this God of the gaps position, is always under threat of being squeezed out of existence. Maybe next year, maybe 10 years from now, maybe a century from now, we'll actually find the mechanism. Well, maybe we'll actually discover that mystery. We'll fill in that remaining gap. And then what happens to our belief in God when that happens? So this is the second possible response to the science-religion conflict, to try to keep, to hold out for some sort of solid, tangible evidence for the divine, which is not going to be under threat of the advance of science. A third response to the tension between science and religion goes under the name conflict. That is, you simply conclude that they're incompatible. You have to throw out one or you have to throw out the other. On the one hand, of course, there are literalists, biblical literalists, Quranic literalists in the East and in the West, those who read scriptures in a very literal way and conclude that the earth is a few thousand years and that we simply have to throw out these results of modern science. There are more eloquent exponents of effectively a creationist viewpoint. Some talk about the need to return to some primordial religious tradition, implicitly rejecting all the advances of the modern world and of modern science. And these, on the surface of it, also sound very enticing. They sound like a lot of the truth has been captured by this, because some of these writers, I'm talking about a school of writers called the traditionalists. They may not be that well known, but they're fairly influential in their own sphere. their idea is that there does exist this primordial tradition that is shared by both East and West. All the Abrahamic religions, the Eastern religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and so forth, they all share some common spiritual core. And what they propose is that we return to this common spiritual core. Of course, the Baha'is believe this as well. We also believe that there is this common spiritual core to the world's religions. But this group of people have to throw out all of modern science to get to that point. And the reason they have to do that is because they haven't realized that to be able to embrace modern science, as the Baha'i writings say we should, and at the same time to maintain our core beliefs, we have to think about certain fundamental categories in fundamentally different ways. And that will be mostly the subject of tomorrow's talk. But I'll go on and continue to set up this conflict, because the second of those who say it's simply incompatible, religion and science are incompatible, sort of opposite to the creationists, you have the what I'll call the new atheists. They reject religion completely, and they reject belief in God completely. I should say at the outset that when I talk about atheism and when I talk about responses to atheism, you can have different things in mind when you hear the word atheism. For many people, the word atheism is virtually synonymous with nihilism. It's like, well, you're an atheist, you don't believe in anything. You don't believe, you believe there's basically no meaning or no sense or no purpose. That's not what I mean when I talk about atheism. When I talk about it, what I have in mind is a more of a considered rejection of God and religion as traditionally conceived, and not necessarily just a sort of, I don't believe in anything. These new atheists come in the form of several very prominent authors and obviously less prominent people. The most prominent of the four have been dubbed the four horsemen of the apocalypse by nervous theologians, no doubt. Richard Dawkins, Chris Hitchens, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, you might have read some of their books. They write very eloquently, they write very persuasively, and they write very uncompromisingly in their rejection of both God and religion. What I'd like to do is try to summarize in as quickly as possible, but I wanted to give enough time to sort of really paint the picture of the depth of their arguments against God and religion. I want to summarize a bit about what they're saying. Briefly, the arguments of the new atheists boil down to sort of a two-pronged attack. They call into question, on the one hand, the existence and the coherence of the existence of God and the coherence of the idea of belief in God. And on the other hand, they call into question the legitimacy of religion and the viability of religion in the modern age. So let me take God first and then religion second, and then I'll look at how people have responded to their attacks, and then later I'll look into these the possible elements in a different approach to the response. So on the subject of God, they have a few points that they would like to make. The first of the points is that the way that God has been understood traditionally is such that it's an absolutely extraordinary claim, that there's this divine being that interferes in the operation of the world on a daily basis, if not momentary basis. That there is a loving, compassionate being who watches over us, who listens to our prayers, occasionally performs miracles, and so forth. These authors point out that to claim that such a being exists is an extraordinary claim. And it's an extraordinary claim that impinges upon the physical world. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary standards of evidence, extraordinary standards of scientific proof. In other words, they turn God into an actual hypothesis, a hypothesis about the physical world. They say, well, if you believe this being exists and this being is interacting with the world in tangible ways, then prove it, in other words. Show me the evidence. Because otherwise, if the being exists and isn't interacting with the world, then why bother? Why bother believing in it? If this being exists and is interacting with the world, then let's see where exactly that interaction is happening. Let's actually go and look for it. And they claim that when it comes to the proof, that there's a lack of tangible evidence. Because anything you can point to, they can say, well, what about human consciousness? What about love? What about beautiful sunsets? Any sort of evidence you can bring. What about the inner feeling that I have? They can, for any one of these, they can say, well, maybe there's a physical explanation. They might not be able to exactly explain it, but they can at least say, well, perhaps it's just this. Perhaps this is just the wiring of your brain. Perhaps this is just your social your social upbringing that's led you to feel this way. Perhaps there's a physical explanation for this for this phenomenon, and so forth. So the one point they make is that if you're going to assert the existence of a divine being, then you need to be able to prove it according to the standards of science. A second point that we find them making on the subject of God is to say that this is in particular in response to this intelligent design movement, this group of people who say that, well, there's irreducible complexity, and that's where we can point to the operation of the divine in the world. And their argument there is that, as I've already sort of brought up, that evolution can potentially explain how all life, even the most seemingly complex life, can be gradually formed over long periods of time through the operation of simple physical laws. In other words, it's not necessary, they would say, to postulate the existence of such a being, because we have at our disposal these various tools which can potentially explain it. So that's an argument that is made contra this argument about complexity and how that may indicate the existence of God. A third point they make is that they say, aside from the constitution of our bodies themselves, aside from the question of how we got here physically, through evolution or whatever mechanism, they argue that our innate sense of morality, our drive towards transcendence, our experience of the sublime through prayer and meditation, can successively be explained in terms of evolution, psychology, and ultimately brain chemistry. They have no proof for this. At this point, it's writing blank checks on unknown accounts. It's saying, well, we have this very powerful set of tools, the scientific method, the instruments of science, and we have a lot of faith that we're ultimately going to explain all of these things. And so they take some of these things and they put them into this category. They put them in the black box and they say, this is all going to be understood. So it's not an entirely satisfying argument that they have, but it's one that it's hard to argue against it. It's hard to argue against it given the past history of this phenomenal advance of science and ultimately explaining what originally was unexplainable. So briefly, they argue on this point about the existence of God, that that this God of the gaps has been squeezed out, and that there's really no need for that hypothesis of the design. And even in the case of the grand designer, even in the ultimate question of how did the universe get here, you have to explain the existence of the universe in the first place. And where do you go with that? You might think that's the last bastion, that's the last place where you have to invoke some sort of creator in order to bring creation into being, to explain how we have something instead of nothing. Even the role that God would play as a creator in that sort of a sense ultimately is sort of taken away by a deft twist of physical theory. that postulates that the universe, as special as it may seem, is actually not all that special, because an infinite number of other universes have been created in parallel to ours. We'll never see them. They're there, but we'll never see them. And this infinite number of other universes all have slightly different values of, say, the gravitational force, or slightly different formulation of the basic laws of physics. But basically that all possibilities have been generated, again through a completely natural process, so that when you look at this universe and how special it seems, and how amazingly suited to the existence of life and consciousness it may appear, they say, well, there are other parallel universes that don't have any life in them. And the reason why our universe seems so special is that we're here to observe it. If it wasn't that special, we wouldn't be here to observe it. Sort of circular logic. But that's actually the reasoning that goes on in the highest circles, in the cosmology community, for example, that it's a way of avoiding coming to the ultimate conclusion that all of the physical processes ultimately can end in a single generative point. Instead, it says that there may be an infinite number of these points. Now, I'm not saying that the Baha'i position is one or the other of these, because I think the answer may be a little bit more subtle. We might think, well, obviously, we must believe that the universe was created by this, that our universe was created by an act of a creator. But it will get more complicated than that, as I'll go into more detail tomorrow. Just briefly, one could ask the question, couldn't it be the case that God is an infinitely creative God, and that there are parallel universes, that there are other realms of which we have no knowledge, of which we could never even conceivably describe or reach? Because if God has created this universe in all its vastness and complexity, but still it's limited in the sense that gravity is a certain strength, and the electromagnetic force is a certain strength, and the laws of physics are a certain structure. Perhaps there are other possibilities that could be unfolded by a different formulation of these laws of physics, but it requires other universes to do it. In other words, who is to say? And we don't know whether it's one or the other, because this is beyond the reach of science now. This is into metaphysics. But who is to say that the idea of God is not compatible with the idea of there being an infinite number of parallel universes? It's equally compatible, of course, with the idea of this one universe that was created, especially for life, or even especially for human life. That's one of these questions that we have to, at this point, sort of step aside from. So those are a few of the arguments that we hear made by atheists today in response to the idea of the existence of God, the coherence of the existence of a supreme being. Let's turn now to their discussion of religion. So, having to their own satisfaction dispensed with the idea of God, they now turn to religion, and they really have a field day here. They really, and they have a lot of material to work with, unfortunately. And they can build their case on a wealth of examples, arguing, first of all, that religious institutions and the texts that they are based on are often man-made. The texts themselves may be complete fabrications, complete creations, or add mixtures of what may have been the original words of a prophetic figure with a human addition. They argue that the institutions that were formed after them are completely crafted out of whole cloth, completely made out of, generated essentially out of thin air by ourselves. They argue, secondly, and this is an obvious one, Mr. Naqshbandi mentioned this morning, that religion has been responsible for so much death and suffering throughout the ages. If possible, more today even than ever in the past. And if one wants to follow the advice of Jesus when he said, "By their fruits ye shall know them," then who can blame people who look at the state of religion today and the amount of suffering that is generated in the name of religion and say, is this the fruit? Does this prove the reality of religion? Of course, it takes different sorts of, from a Baha'i point of view, it takes a different set of eyes. It takes the eye of insight to look beyond these hollowed out shells and to look beyond this dead underbrush of the old, to see those green shoots, to see those seedlings of a new civilization which are just starting to poke above the surface, which are largely invisible still, but you have to have this a very keen eyesight to see them coming and to realize that this decline of religion, it's a cyclical thing. And understanding that we're at the lowest point of this cycle and at the beginning of a new cycle is one way of understanding how it is that something which should be so sublime, something which should be creating such joy and unity and peace and happiness, is instead appears to be the cause of so much suffering. Thirdly, they argue against religion that, well, religious laws are outdated. Religious social laws are outdated, if they were even relevant in the first place, they would say. Looking at the laws of marriage, looking at all sorts of the laws, dietary requirements, and so forth, you can look at any of the existing religious systems and find a multitude of examples of laws and ordinances which simply are not practical, which simply could not be executed or carried through in their totality in this day, or which would involve a violation of other basic principles, like a violation of the principle of the equality of the sexes and so forth. So many of the laws and ordinances of former times are simply no longer suited to this day. Up until this point, you might feel, hold on, I'm agreeing with all these points. But that's exactly the point that we're going to come to. Fourthly, they argue that religion has historically been in conflict with reason and has impeded the progress of science. This is another very easy thing to argue. Look at Galileo, the persecution of Galileo by the church, the burning of Bruno at the stake, and so many other examples of the suppression of science in recent centuries by organized religion. And finally, they argue, and this is something they have no proof for, but this is what they argue, is that religion is in any case irrelevant to the modern age because an ethical life can be lived without religion. Now, we may contest that, and we may actually say, well, you may think you're living your ethical, because maybe there are people there who don't, maybe there are people in the world, and there are many people in the world who live a good, upstanding life, who do good works, who have a expansive view of the world, who are working towards world peace, but they don't believe in God. They don't believe in religion, but they believe in these principles. What are we to do about those people? Abdu'l-Baha actually answers this question. What are we to do about these people? What is our position regarding these people? Someone asked Abdu'l-Baha that precise question, and it's in the final chapter of Some Answered Questions. So what's the deal here? For people who are so good and they're doing so many great things in the world, but their lives are not oriented around God and religion. And Abdu'l-Baha has an answer to that. I'm not going to give one answer, and this is not Abdu'l-Baha's answer. One answer to this is that even sometimes when you think that you're doing something without reference to religion or God, it's simply a part of the air we breathe. The religion has been instrumental in bringing to us in this day our notion of the freedoms that we enjoy, and with which we're able to deny God and religion. But when we do so, we're doing so breathing the air that has been generated by religion and by through the influence of and inspiration of religion over the centuries. Anyway, I don't want to get into I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself a bit here and getting to the sort of rebuttal of the rebuttal. But I want to end there. I don't want to sort of drag this on too long, but this hopefully gives a bit of a little bit of a perspective on what exactly are atheists saying. What exactly are they saying about belief in God? How are they trying to deconstruct belief in God, and how are they trying to deconstruct belief in religion and the idea of religion as a viable social force in the world? Now, I have until 12. Okay, so I'll finish this section, and then for the new approach, we're going to have, I'll talk about that tomorrow. But what I wanted to conclude with today is to talk about the inadequacy of the response to the new atheists, to set up how we might think of a different way of responding to it tomorrow, both from the side of physics and from the side of the Baha'i writings. People have, on the side of belief in God, and I've already touched upon this, but it just bears reiterating, that for many people, they're really holding out for some sort of tangible proof. The intelligent design camp is a great example of this, of people who still ultimately believe that eventually science is going to find that God particle. We're eventually going to discover that, that particular wiring of the human brain or something that represents that connection between the divine and the world of matter. This idea actually goes back several centuries. The French philosopher Descartes was one of the founders of the idea of dualism, the idea that there are material things, there's material stuff, and there's spiritual stuff. And these are two fundamentally different kinds of substances. How do they interact? He wasn't sure, but he had a theory that in the center of the brain, there was a gland called the pineal gland. And his theory was that matter and spirit intersected somewhere deep in the brain in this pineal gland. So that shows how little we understood. We still actually don't understand what the pineal gland does, I don't think. If there are any brain people in the audience, we understand so little about the brain, but I think we're pretty sure now that the pineal gland is not the magical sort of gate between the physical and the spiritual world. But it's that kind of thinking which still persists. There's still that kind of thinking that persists, that somewhere we're going to find on a particular reading of an instrument or a particular setting on the dial, we're going to find that evidence for the existence of a higher being. As you can probably guess by how I'm saying it, I'm going to call that way of thinking into question in tomorrow's section and ask, is this really what we're looking for? Is this really the kind of God that we're looking for and the kind of God that we believe in? So on the side of religion, people have made a number of attempted responses. And these attempted responses, I think, have all really fallen short. They've argued, for instance, that, well, the atheists, they're taking the extreme. They're taking the very worst cases. For instance, the suppression of rights, suffering and death in the name of religion, wars and so forth. And they're proceeding as if it were the normal thing. In other words, they're attacking a straw man. They're attacking something which is not really the reality of religion. But great things are done in the name of religion, which is true. But ultimately, it only sort of blunts the attack a little bit. It doesn't really get at it doesn't address the reality of all of the terrible things that are and have been done in the name of religion. They argue that, they argue from anecdotal evidence. As we all know, they have spectacular material to work with. They have the Crusades, they have the Inquisition, they have 9/11, they have child sexual abuse scandals in the clergy and so forth. All of these, they would say, are just the extreme examples. But in reality, religion does much good in the world, which I don't think we would disagree with. But ultimately, it's not really an answer. It's not a proper answer. They argue from anachronism. They say, well, the atheists are retroactively applying our current value system on ancient cultures. And that does happen. And you see these writers doing this a lot. They talk about Moses and the laws of the Torah as if it were the 20th century. And they say, well, it's ridiculous that God would say, do this, do that, do that. And of course it doesn't make sense in light of the changing needs of society in the modern age. But again, that's only a partial answer. They argue also that you're mistaking cause and effect. They'll say, is it really religion that causes evil, or is it just human nature? And religion is the excuse. Religion is the tool for all of these things that are done in its name. But so these are just a few of the responses that are given, but they all suffer from the same failing, and that is that they fail to really come to complete grips with the fact that appallingly terrible things have been done and are being done in the name of religion, and to understand how it can be that religion is a viable force for today. We have to have a different view, a fundamentally different view of religion, a fundamentally different view of what religion is, how it evolves, how it progresses through cycles of growth and decay. We also need to understand and to counteract arguments that atheists make about the existence of God. We have to rethink what exactly do we mean when we say the word God, when we refer to God. Just to say a word or two in anticipation of what will be a larger point tomorrow. The Baha'i writings say unequivocally that God is beyond all names and attributes. Anything that we can think of, God is not. And this goes to the most fundamental things which we think we can say about God. Abdu'l-Baha in Some Answered Questions says the divine reality is sanctified above singleness. How much more above plurality? Even saying God is one is itself, oneness, plurality. These are all attributes of things, not attributes of that divine essence. And ultimately, when we understand the absolute abstractness, the absolute transcendence and unknowability of the Creator, then some of these arguments against God's existence, as well as many of the arguments for God's existence, many of the traditional proofs that have been given for God's existence. There's a cosmological proof, an ontological proof, a teleological proof. There's all sorts of different categories of proofs for God's existence. All become almost no longer valid in a technical sense. They still may retain usefulness as a way of indicating sort of the right direction to go. We get a sense that Abdu'l-Baha did this in Some Answered Questions, when in one of the early questions of chapters of Some Answered Questions, after giving one or two proofs, Abdu'l-Baha says, "These proofs have been adduced for weak minds, but if the eye of inner insight be opened, 100,000 clear proofs will become evident." So although even Abdu'l-Baha often uses and brings out these logical proofs for God's existence, we get the sense that even he might not have meant that these are valid in a precise mathematical sense, but rather these are indications. These are all gestures. These are fingers pointing at the moon. And to get from the tip of the finger to the moon, there's a very long distance indeed, and that distance has to be traversed by the intuition and not by reason. So that's all that we have time for today. I hope that I haven't scared you off by technical talk. I sort of got a bit into the nitty-gritty, but tomorrow I'm going to turn half to modern physics, no equations, I promise, and half to glimpses of a way forward, a third way we'll call it, from the Baha'i writings. Thanks for